is the German phase. Hitler came to power in January 1933. Until September 1939, Germany was not officially at war. Those 6 years are a very particular phase of development of the Nazi project, where a lot of steps were taken inside Germany to isolate German Jews from the rest of the population, to start measures sterilizing, isolating, and eventually even to start killing. To rearm Germany to prepare for the war of conquest, but also to cover up that rearmament by talking peaceful intentions publicly so that people elsewhere in the world wouldn't be too alarmed. So there's a lot of preparation that occurred in that phase, 33 to 39, to get the German population on board. And I think often when studying the Holocaust, people want to rush straight to the gas chambers. But you don't understand how you got there without seeing that phase of preparation.
What was the first sign of the changing when Hitler came into power? When did you start to feel change?
Very easily, I can explain that. First of all the children we used to play with either ignored us or threw stones at us, or just called us Jew. Or for a child who doesn't know what the difference is between a Christian and Jew, except that they went to a church, we went to a synagogue. And it hurt because we'd been friends, and I was only 4 years old. And the main memory was the fact that my father's best friend was the village policeman. And I remember, being a very nosy child, coming down one night hearing voices. And there was the village policeman and my father, the policeman who we called Uncle, saying to my father, Julius, don't talk to me in the street because I can't talk to you. If I shout at you, forgive me. Tell the children they mustn't call me Uncle. Because he said, I have to wear this dreadful uniform, I have a family, and I have to live here. And for the first time in my young life, I discovered that men could cry. I never knew that. I knew I could cry when I was hurt, but for men to cry, that I didn't know. And that was the greatest shock of all. As I said, I was only 4 years old, and all these little friends who one took for granted suddenly turned into little enemies.
I think you could say a second phase, let's say September 1939 to June 1941. Extremely important phase of taking Nazi violence and expanding it from outside of Germany into Poland, into Western Europe, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and also Norway and Denmark. And there you see an increase in violence, mass violence against subject populations, people with disabilities, ghettoization, other almost experiments and conquest on a much larger scale, coupled with a war of domination, but still with certain limits territorially.
From 1939 to 1941, 70,000 Germans with mental or physical disabilities were murdered by the Nazis. The executions were part of a secret euthanasia program called T4 that was designed to weed out unwanted biological characteristics. The goal was to create a master race of perfect people. In 1941, upon learning of the euthanasia program, Clemens August Graf von Galen, Bishop of Munster, spoke out.
Bishop von Galen, later became Archbishop and later a Cardinal, was a Roman Catholic churchman from Germany who, when he initially became a bishop, was actually known for being quite sympathetic to Nazism. But with the so-called euthanasia program, murder of disabled people, von Galen increasingly became distressed. And he began to gather information, and others sort of helped him to give a series of sermons in which he denounced the killing of people as handicapped.
However, may a man, except in war and in lawful defense, take the life of an innocent person.
And among other things, what's so profound about the sermons is that he described in no uncertain terms this killing program as murder. And he said something like, murder is against the law. It is against the law of God, and it's against the law of our country. And this is murder. He gave specific examples. One of the sermons he said, I know a man from our parish, an elderly man. He is no longer in the kind of health he once was, but he served this country loyally in the last war, and now he's in an institution. His son is fighting in the German army on the Eastern Front. What will the son say when he learns that his father has been deemed unworthy of life? So it's not only making the moral claim that this is wrong, although he made that claim too, it's also making the practical claim that, wait a second, if you begin to define lives as worthy of living only if they contribute to the common good, whatever that might be, who gets to decide what that common good is? And what's that going to mean for morale in a country where you're at war and you depend on soldiers and their families to support that war effort? Hitler believed Germany lost the First World War because of the home front and the collapse of morale and so on. Bishop von Galen, he was very, very clever in the way he pitched the argument. So he gave, that argument about the effect this would have on the military. And he also said, and what will happen to soldiers who themselves become injured, become damaged physically or mentally? Will they too be thrown away like an old machine or like a cow? He didn't mention the killing of Jews. He didn't talk much about sort of racial notions. What he talked about was murder, and a murder that he presented in such a way that everyone listening could think, that could be me. They were important not only because they were spoken in public, but because they were printed and distributed quite widely inside Germany and also outside. And you can see the importance of that because being a Roman Catholic bishop, he had connections with, Catholic circles elsewhere. And of course, Hitler was furious. Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, they were furious about these sermons at the public nature of them. Although initially they said, we have to punish him, get rid of him. They realized he was very popular. He had a big following in his own community, and he had international connections. But especially inside Germany in wartime, it was too risky to take a popular church leader, make like a clash with the Catholic Church. Remember, 40% of Germany's population was Catholic. Hitler himself was a Catholic. It was not worth it. So von Galen was allowed to remain in his post. He wasn't really punished. The program did change, became less open, more efforts to conceal, but also the targets of the program changed. Increasingly, it was not institutionalized Germans and children who were targeted, but rather concentration camp workers who were no longer able to perform labor. So the T4 program became more like about disposing of unwanted people, rather than people whose relatives, family, community members might be there to speak out on their behalf. And then with invasion of the Soviet Union, it's like absolute, the next line of mass killing. The Einsatzgruppen and the killing squads that accompanied German armies as they went into Soviet territory. Even ghettos and labor camps that had existed in Poland since 1939, many of them liquidated, which means the people taken out of them and killed. And then 41 to approximately the end of 44, this is a period of absolute, you could say, dedication to mass killing. Soviet prisoners of war, the Jews of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, sent to Auschwitz to be killed, starving of civilian populations, including non-Jews. Treblinka, Sobibor, those weren't concentration camps. People didn't live there. People were sent there to be murdered.
So what do you learn when you study one place in detail? It's very hard to understand when you are studying the entire phenomenon, say World War II or the Holocaust or any genocide really. What do you learn when you look at one place? You learn that nothing is black and white and nothing is as simple as it may appear. Rarely is there absolute altruism, absolute good, or even absolute evil. Things are always much more complicated than that. T1, Buchach becomes part of Poland. There is already a legacy of violence, of mayhem, of destruction. I should say about 2,000 houses are destroyed in Buchach during the war, just from shelling. So there's a legacy of violence, of destruction, and of ethnic animosity. And that was really the preoccupation of politicians and peoples throughout Eastern Europe for the next 20 years until the outbreak of World War II. So by the late 1930s, you find a region that is in crisis. Now we have Nazi Germany, which is rising in the west, and the Soviet Union in the east, and both of them are looking directly at this area as an area that they would like to take over. So the next crucial moment in the history of this town, and again, it's both very specific to the town and symptomatic of the area, is that in September 1939, right after the agreement between Hitler and Stalin, known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, Germany invades Poland, and 17 days later, on the 17th of September, the Red Army invades the other side of Poland, eastern Poland, and takes over Galicia. That's in agreement with the Germans. There's no fighting between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht at that point. The result of that is that Soviet rule is imposed on Buchach. That period of 2 years of Soviet rule has a huge impact on the subsequent violence, because the Soviets do away with the elites of all three groups, and they orchestrate violence against all the groups that incites one group against the other.
In June 1941, the Germans broke their pact with the Kremlin, launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military campaign in the history of warfare.
And as the Germans are coming in, the Germans and Ukrainian nationalists who are marching together with the Germans say the Bolsheviks and the Jews are the same, the Jews have killed our patriots. And that unleashes a wave of pogroms all over Galicia, including in Buchach. And so the kind of license for violence that had already been given by the Soviets is now entirely open. From that point on, that town, Buchach, and all the towns in this region are subjected to extraordinary range and extent of violence for the next 4 years. Between one akция and another, the Jews try to hide. Now, they may hide in a bunker that they dig, under their own floor into the side of the mountain, but they often will try to hide in the villages. And when you go to the village, you say to the villager, look, I'll give you money to buy food and all that, and also I'll compensate you for this, but hide me. So the villagers say, fine. Yeah, they're all poor. And now the question is, what happens? Let's say you run out of money. What do they do with you? They can't afford to buy you the extra food. Any extra food they buy is, in any case, noticed very quickly by your neighbors, because these are small and very poor villages. Why are you buying an extra liter of milk? There's something, what's going on here? Where do you have the money from? So you can either be totally altruistic and somehow keep them, you can throw them out, or, safest for you, you can denounce them. You can say, these Jews just moved into my barn, I don't know what they're doing here, come get them. You call the local police come, take them out and shoot them on the spot. Often they don't use the Germans at all. Eventually, the vast majority of the Jewish population of Buchach and the surrounding area is killed. What is again unique to Buchach, and a particularly painful tale, is that in March 1944, the Red Army liberates Buchach. And as the Red Army comes in, up to 800 Jews come out of hiding, both in the city itself and in surrounding villages. However, 2 weeks later, there's a counter-offensive by the German army, and the town is retaken by the Germans, and almost all of those Jews who survived are killed. They try to escape with the Red Army. Many of them are very weak, of course, because they've been in hiding, they cannot walk, they're famished, and the Red Army is not particularly interested in taking them along. By the time the Red Army returns, in July 1944, maybe 100 Jews survive. So that's the end of that community. So you immediately understand that in a genocide like this, you cannot stay within the relationship between perpetrators and victims, because in no place does that happen. There is a social environment to that. And that social environment feeds into the nature of the killing, the nature of the event. And these so-called bystanders, who have been recognized, people like saying, well, we have perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. That in small towns, there are no bystanders. That the notion of a bystander is a contradiction in terms when you think about what happens in a town when killing starts. It's not that people just sit and look. what you find in these little towns is not that there was dehumanization. On the contrary, there was intimacy. The whole event was entirely intimate. You're never simply a bystander. You're always part of the event. And the smaller the town is, everyone knows everyone else. So these are things that you cannot understand when you look from the top and you say, well, this was industrial murder. People from Berlin were put on a train. They went to Auschwitz. In 20 minutes, they were dead in a gas chamber. You know, it was dehumanizing. It was mechanized. No one really was involved. Here, everyone was involved. And this event, what happened in this town of, let's say, 15,000 people, happened in hundreds and hundreds of towns throughout Eastern Europe. In fact, half of the Holocaust happened like that.
The last 5 months of the war. January 1945, liberation of Auschwitz, till May 1945, the end of the war, you might think, well, then surely the killing would have stopped and people would have tried to go home. But there you have the emergence of another, you could say, form of mass killing. No more gas chambers, right? Auschwitz was liberated. Those earlier camps, Treblinka and Sobibor, they were closed even sooner. Death marches were the method of killing. As guards, the administrators emptied out the sites of concentration camps, labor camps of all kinds. They put those remaining prisoners into big, long columns, and they marched them. Those death marches, they get that name because they were deadly. So many people who'd survived months, sometimes years, in certain kind of camps, they were shot along the way by the Germans. Sometimes they were killed by Allied strafing and bombs and stuff, right? Because they tried to destroy the roads, so the Germans themselves couldn't retreat. Sometimes they died of disease, you know, so close to the end. Sometimes people ran away from the column. The guards shot them dead. Other times they ran away from the column and they were able to blend in with the local population. Sometimes, obviously, they made it, but it's estimated maybe 250,000 people died in those last months of the war, just in those death marches alone.
There were one or two Jews originally from Germany who managed to survive and still in the camp. And I wrote to the authorities and said, what is the future of these people? If they go back to their native towns, how will they be retreated? And the answer I got shook me too. He said, as long as they are in the camp, they'll be treated like survivors. Once they go back to their native cities in Germany, they will be treated like Germans, which is irrespective of what they'd been through, the fact that they have been victims of Nazi Germany. And this was brought home to me very, very, very vividly. I had the opportunity to go to Berlin. It was part of my area because the British zone of occupied Berlin. I arrived there and I looked for Jews. The synagogues had been destroyed, of course, in the Kristallnacht of November 37. For what? I found that on a Saturday morning, Jews were having a service in the hall attached to one of these synagogues that had been destroyed. And I was deeply moved by the fact that they had been survived. Many of them had been in Theresienstadt and had come back to Germany, Berlin. And I said to them, look, I'm only here for a day or so. If you want to communicate with anybody anywhere in the world to tell them you're alive, I will collect your letters tomorrow morning, and I will distribute them. I collected them on the Sunday morning, and when I got back to my office, I separated them according to countries. To Palestine, it was easier. South Africa, to England, there was a sort of a unit that was responsible for tracing people. And I sent them off in batches. I heard no more. Until one bright day I was hauled up before my local chief chaplain, who said to me, you have been breaking the law. What have I done? Apparently, somebody who received such a letter wrote to a relative in Switzerland to say that they had heard so-and-so was still alive in Berlin, and if you want to communicate with them, send me the letter and I will send it off. So I was accused by military intelligence. This was intercepted by military intelligence, and they I was duly reprimanded. I was breaking the laws of censorship and whatnot, acting as a sort of unofficial postman. So I said to my chief, who was my superior in rank, do you mind if I speak to you as a clergyman to clergyman, or must I speak to you as a major to a colonel? Oh, of course I'm a clergyman first. I said, do you know what these people wrote? I am alive. I have survived. No military intelligence involved. A purely humanitarian gesture. And all he could say to me was, trouble with you, Levy, is you're too much of a Jewish nationalist. What's nationalism got to do with it? I don't know. But this was the sort of attitude. Again, an example of how they didn't understand the situation.
I came into contact with quite a bit of anti-Semitism. We had a mess sergeant, who at that time he was the assistant mess sergeant, named Cooley. Cooley came from someplace, I have it in my records, either North Carolina or South Carolina or Georgia, in that area. And he was a racist to the roots. And he would call me Jew boy and kike. And on more than one occasion, we literally had to be separated, physically separated. I think he actually could have almost erased me. But I had made a vow to myself when I was a kid that never again would I accept that without fighting back, and that was my pattern. Overseas, when we were no longer actually in combat, there was an opportunity or a situation where I literally came very close to and almost killed him for anti-Semitism. We had picked up some liberated, displaced persons. They were wandering along the road, and they pleaded with us because they wanted to get back as close as they could to where they had last seen any of their relatives still alive. And they would sew our uniforms, help the cooks, work on our vehicles, sew on patches, whatever they could do for us, even cut hair, just so we would take them along as we traveled. I came home from a patrol one day with 5 or 6 other fellas, and we heard a large commotion in the camp area where we were. And we dropped our gear on the floor, on the ground, and went to see what was going on. And I realized, I heard Cooley's voice yelling, "You dirty kike, blankety blank blank blank. You'll eat all of that or I'll kill you." And I pushed my way through the crowd and sitting on a box was this displaced person, Grisha. He had a large can of peanut butter that was open in his lap, big spoon in his hand. He had peanut butter smeared all over his face. And Cooley was screaming out of every invective imaginable. It horrified me that anybody could, whatever he was doing, whatever caused it, didn't even matter. This was a man, a Jew, from a camp. And Cooley, the anti-Semite, was doing this to him. And I walked over, I knocked the can out of Grisha's hand and pulled him to his feet and pushed him away. And of course, Cooley turned to me and screamed, "What the hell do you think you're doing, you kike bastard?" And I remember as I faced Cooley, I took my pistol from my belt and holding it down at my side, I said, "Cooley, if I ever see you treat another Jew like this again, I'll kill you." And I brought the hammer back. It sounded like a steel door being slammed. It was so quiet, the crowd around us didn't make a sound. Cooley looked at me with disbelief, and he turned around and pushed his way out of the crowd. I've thought about that so very, very many times. And I swear to this day, I don't know, had he stood up to me, what could have happened? I don't know if I could have or I would have. I don't know. But those days, we weren't human. I can't say we were living like animals, because animals don't act that way. But the euphemism of being human and sane just didn't exist anymore. We weren't normal. We just weren't normal in those days. And whether I could have, I don't know. But Cooley never came near me again. He avoided me like the plague.
Why do you want kids to make a bridge?
Well, I try to empower them. I try to tell them that they can change by being kind, that they can make their life easier by themselves if they get rid of a hate for somebody who is not the same color or doesn't believe in the same God. I say those are private things. And just because somebody doesn't believe in the same God or somebody is a different color, is still the same human being as you are. And if you want to have a better world for yourself or for your children, then it's up to you. There is a lot of things people can do to make life better if they only understood that they have the power to make things better.